behalf of Dr. Mark Rosenberg, our president, I would like to welcome all of you to our beautiful Biscayne Bay campus. My name is Stephen Mall, and I am the Vice Provost in charge of operations here at this university and this campus, and we are delighted to have you all here this evening. I have a few announcements to make before we get going, so if you will bear with me just for a few moments. We ask that anyone present in this room with the intent to disrupt, to please leave the room at this point and gather in the area adjacent to this building, which has been set aside to civilly and peacefully express dissent and differences of opinion. Everyone remaining in this room has made a commitment to respect our freedom to peacefully assemble and will refrain from disrupting this event. Anyone who disrupts the orderly conduct of this lecture will be peacefully removed by police officers who you see are present in this room. The removal will be followed by the initiation of applicable due process procedures concerning the conduct of the individual involved, depending on the nature of that person's association with this university. Students will be subject to the Student Code of Conduct, and others will be subject to applicable disciplinary sanctions or other interventions. So, let us proceed with our event. It is now my pleasure to introduce a very dear friend of mine and a very distinguished colleague here at the university, Dr. John Stack. Dr. Stack is the Executive Director of SIPA, which stands for the School of International and Public Affairs. He is also the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and is one of our top scholars here at this university. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. John Stack.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Vice Provost Steve Mole. Also a dear friend and good evening to everyone. It's a distinct pleasure to be able to host this event at FIU's gorgeous Biscayne Bay campus. Tonight's program is part of our Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. This is the signature speakers and lecture series in the School of International and Public Affairs, and we are very, very grateful to the Shepard Broad Foundation for the generous gift that has made this series possible. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge Ann Bustle, the daughter of Ruth and Shepard Broad, who is with us here tonight. Ann, please stand and be recognized. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Shlomi Dinar, my colleague, who is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and who is director of our Middle East Society, for his invaluable help. Shlomi, where are you? In the back. Good applause, Shlomi. Through the Middle East Society, Dr. Dinar brings exceptional speakers to Biscayne Bay who present a variety of perspectives on the Middle East. It's a labor of love for Shlomi and an important outreach initiative for SIPA. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to say a few words about tonight's format. After the presentation, Ambassador Waxman will take questions from the audience. Our questions will be in the form of questions provided on the index cards that everyone has. Dr. Dinar and our staff will collect them and read as many as time allows. I ask that you please write legibly and pose only one brief question in order to canvass the range of opinions represented here. Our distinguished speaker this evening is the Honorable Haim Waxman, Israel's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Ambassador Waxman is a career diplomat. Prior to his current posting, he served as the Director of the Department for Non-Proliferation in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. between 2005 and 2007, he headed the Department for Defense Export Controls. In that capacity, Ambassador Waxman was closely involved in the reform of the national system of export controls and legislation in Israel. During this period, he was a member of the United Nations Group of Experts on Illicit Brokering and Small Arms and Light Weapons. Ambassador Waxman served as counselor at the Permanent Mission of Israel to the UN office in Geneva from 1999 until 2004, where he represented Israel in various international organizations and programs. From 1992 to 1996, Ambassador Waxman served as consul and deputy chief of mission at Israel's Consulate General in Toronto, Canada. He also held a number of other positions in the Foreign Ministry, including posts in the Africa Division and the Middle East Economic Department. He was appointed to his current post in August 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Waxman.
Thank you, John, for this warm introduction. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this evening. I hope we will be able to have some kind of a dialogue here. I intend to talk for a few minutes and then open them up, because I think the interesting part will be your questions and the dialogue we're going to conduct. I think probably less interesting will be the introduction. I don't know, maybe. But I'm really looking forward to talking to you, to be here. I'm very happy to be here at the university. I'm happy because of many reasons. First of all, there's much better climate here than in New York, and that is not just that in terms of temperature. It's also some kind related somehow also to the atmosphere that we Israeli diplomats are sometimes facing in the UN. Maybe I'll tell you a bit about that. And actually, with everything that is happening these days, and you're probably watching the news, I was not sure I'll be able to be here today. Actually, I was quite sure I won't be able to be here today. And so I'm very happy to eventually be able to come because, you know, we found 1 or 2 days that were not too critical, because we had quite a few months now that have been very, very intensive. So let me say maybe a few words about what does it mean to be an Israeli diplomat in the UN. And then maybe a few words about the issue that probably many of you are interested in, which is the Palestinian moves in the United Nations. And then maybe again, just a few words about the way we perceive ourselves in the international scene in general. Israel has I believe tonight's title is Israel and the UN. Israel has a complex relationship with the UN system. You know, whenever you say I have a complex relationship, you know there's an issue there. Even when you're talking about personal issues. On one hand, we very much appreciate the work, the important work that is being done in many areas and facets and organizations of the UN system, because as you know, the UN is a very complex system. Whether it's in health, whether it's in telecommunication, whether it's in education, in many areas, the UN is doing important work. I know that because I served in Geneva and I saw some of this work very up close, and I know that if the WHO, the World Health Organization, didn't exist, it had to be reinvented today. Because someone has to coordinate the international response to diseases, to health problems in general. The UN also played an interesting and important role in the history of the Middle East, in the history of Israel. Both the UN and Israel were born after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. few time frames in which the UN played an important role in our history, in the history of the Middle East. Some of the resolutions, for instance, in the Security Council, most notably Resolution 242, 338, were resolutions that actually laid a framework for the peace process ever since. And it deals with, it being the UN, deals with issues that are important to Israel. For instance, the memory of the Holocaust, or dealing with some of the issues that are plaguing our region, first and foremost, for instance, the Iranian problem. And then comes a big but, and that's really what makes it complex and not a simple question. Because of the way the UN is structured, this parliamentarian setting in which we are one country, and on the other side, and unfortunately in many ways, many times it's the other side. You have countries belonging to the Arab League, more than 20 countries, or countries that belong to the Organization of Islamic Countries, that already 55, 56 countries, and then the non-aligned movement, you're getting to 118, 130 countries, depends on which coalition you're looking at. We have been subject to, in the last few decades, to quite a few negative phenomena that are really affecting almost everything we do in the UN. The main one maybe is politicization. On almost every issue that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, there's an attempt to inject the Middle East conflict into it and try to come up with some kind of a product which will discriminate Israel. Of course, the worst example is resolution, you may have remembered, 3379 from 1975 that equated Zionism with racism. But we are actually seeing that in many other occasions. And again, I stress, and almost you would be surprised the kind of issues that are supposed to be completely professional, completely non-political, in which these things are happening. Secondly, you have the issue of discrimination. The UN works with regional groups, and until 2000, Israel was not part of one of these groups. It was the only country which was not part. And even today, when we are part, still Israel is not a full member completely. Again, this is a rare occasion of singling out. But mostly there's this double standards. When I say double standards, look, we are facing every year more than 20 annual resolutions in the UN system that deal with the situation and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict. Those resolutions, and again, they come back year after year, are completely one-sided, are completely devoid of any context. Some of them were voted last week. You didn't see the word Hamas appear in any of them, because Hamas doesn't exist. There are no rockets that are coming from Gaza. There is no, even in the positive side, there is no improvement in the economic situation in the West Bank. No, that is not there. There's nothing to relate that relates those resolutions to the actual situation on the ground. And again, these are more than 20 resolutions. And you have this phenomena across the UN system. I'll tell you, I'll give you one example which I think, in my mind, is the most flagrant one. The main UN body that deals with human rights is the Council of Human Rights that sits in Geneva. That body has a constant agenda. It has two items that are being debated every time they meet. One is called Item 4. Deals with violation of human rights around the world, under which all the countries are being debated. And one, Item 7, that deals only with Israel. There's nothing like it. Half of the special sessions of that body are dealing with Israel. You have special bodies in the UN secretariats. Their sole raison d'etre is disseminating a narrative happens in the real world, and sometimes it's a world in itself. Rockets are coming from the Gaza Strip constantly, as we speak every day almost, on our towns and villages in the south. Hundreds of thousands of children are not going to school. Any condemnation from the UN body? We have a terrorist attack from our border religion. Any condemnation? People are killed, civilians are being killed. Nothing. On the other hand, look what's happened on the other side. Syria, where the government is butchering its civilians, its people. Whether is the Security Council able to accept or adopt a resolution against Syria? No. No way. What will the UN do with the new IAEA report, International Atomic Energy Agency report, that says very clearly that Iran is working on a nuclear bomb? What will be the consequences in the UN context? Probably not very much. So this is the situation. That's the situation. And unfortunately, again, it's part of what we know and live with because of what we call the automatic majority on the UN setting, especially in the General Assembly. But I have to stress one point. We're facing this problem, we're addressing this issue. But when we do that, when we're fighting this politicization, we set ourselves a goal already, I think at least a decade ago, that in parallel to doing that, to the best of our ability, because we run country after all, we will take part in every professional meeting of the UN. We will try to contribute as much as we can to the professional work of the UN. So Israel is sending policemen to Haiti, and this is after we sent, of course, a field hospital just after the outbreak. Israel is conducting events around the World Day of Autism. Israel is now sponsoring for the third time a resolution in agriculture technology in which we cooperate with developing countries around the world, especially with African countries. Israel hosted last week a seminar that is related to the Rio +20 summit next year in Rio, dealing with environmental issues. We're doing all that. We're going to get into the boards of some of the important developing agencies of the UN next year. We're doing many, many things like that. Because we want, again, on one hand, we will continue to fight what's wrong with the UN, but we will continue to project and to contribute as much as we can to the good side and to the good work that the UN is doing. This is really, in a nutshell, what it means to be an Israeli diplomat in the UN. It's complex, but it's actually very fascinating and interesting. And whoever of you is thinking maybe of joining foreign ministry or working for the UN should know that it's a fascinating environment. It's a complicated environment, and it's perhaps not the best environment to try to work peace in the Middle East. And this is maybe a time to talk a little bit about the Palestinian issue. And I think many of you are interested, and I understand some of you may have probably different views than I am going to project here, and that's not too bad. Again, I'm happy to have a dialogue, and I'll be happy to ask questions, and I'll try to the best of my ability to answer.
We actually collected cards.
Yeah, no, I'm not finished
Oh,
yet.
you're not
in the Security Council to pass. It's not just the US veto there. They don't have the votes. And now they're thinking how to continue. And I hope that thinking, and we hope, that thinking will bring them to leave that route. Because we believe that route, in the end of the day, even if it brings some received achievements, will not get them what they want and what they need. If they really want a Palestinian state, that will not come through the UN. Peace cannot be imposed. I don't want to say something because you might hear it, so I'll just wait until you leave.
Ambassador, could you speak more directly into the mic?
Sure.
Thank you. I don't want to miss a word you say.
Sure. It's a bit unfortunate. I think it would have been better to try and sit and listen and maybe ask a question and maybe develop a dialogue. And I thought this is what you do in university, right?
Yes.
And not just leave. And then if there was a message there, I didn't get it. You can relay that to the students who were left. So let me again reiterate the way we see things. Peace cannot be imposed. Peace cannot come from going to a third party and trying to impose your views. It can only come from sitting with in the beginning it's your opponent or your negotiating partner, and discuss the issues and sometimes make very difficult decisions. And we know that both sides will have to make very difficult decisions, including us. And then you can have an agreement. This is the only way, not the way, the only way by which a real Palestinian state can come up, can be created. The other ways are perhaps looks to be or seems to be cheaper. Sometimes it looks as if there's no cost. You come to the UN, to the General Assembly, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, President of the Palestinian Authority, came on the 23rd of September, as you remember. You get a lot of applause. You've been treated like Elton John sometimes. You go back home, and then what? And then what? The only way is has anything changed on the ground? Will anything change on the ground? Even if they manage to pass a resolution in the General Assembly in the future? No. The only thing that will happen is that they will create an expectation gap between what happens in New York and what happens on the ground, that neither they, nor us, nor anybody else know exactly how it will be filled. One possibility is it might be filled with violence, which is bad for Israel, but not only for Israel. It's bad for the Palestinian, it's bad for whoever is interested in peace in the Middle East. The only way to have peace in the Middle East is for Palestinians and Israelis to sit without preconditions and negotiate the terms of the agreement. The Palestinians have applied to become a UN member. Now, the report that came from the admission committee last Friday showed that it's not that easy. It's not that easy because there are some questions, very serious questions, that have to be asked. And the Palestinians will have to answer them one day or another before they become a state. For instance, one of the requirements talks about having effective control over the territory. Does Mahmoud Abbas have effective control over Gaza? He cannot even visit Gaza since 2007. He cannot lay his foot in Gaza. 40% of his people live there, but he cannot visit. Is this what you call effective control? Another requirement talks about a country being peace-loving. Is Hamas a peace-loving entity? Hamas is not ready to recognize Israel, whose charter talks about the annihilation of Israel and throwing all the Jews out. Is this a peace-loving entity? So who exactly On behalf of whom exactly this application was submitted? So the question arises, and some countries in the Security Council ask, do the Palestinians stand by these treaties? And the obvious answer is no. And again, the only way is to sit with us. The only way is to make sure that the vital interests of both sides are secured. We will not have a situation where we left Gaza and you see what happens. We will not repeat that in the West Bank. We will not repeat that. Because then it means probably the end of Israel. We will not let that happen. We will have to make sure that the security is guaranteed. We will have to make sure that when we sign a peace treaty, and it's really, really important, maybe the most important point, the other side signs very clearly and can commit and can be able to also to fulfill it, that this is the end of the conflict, that there's no more demands, that it's not just a springboard to try and get more, maybe by violence. No. In the end of the day, sometimes, these things, you have to be able to sit down. It's like when you get a house from a contractor. You say, I'm signing here and here. I got the house. That's it. It's very, very difficult. It sounds simple. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for some people who have always been identified with the conflict itself to finish the conflict, to put it to an end, to start concentrating on the positive agenda, on building. It's not that easy. Because again, we will have to make great sacrifices, we understand that. But the other side will have to make them as well. The other side will have to forsake the idea that millions of Palestinian refugees will go to Israel. Mainly because it makes no sense. You don't create one country, Palestine, in order to send your Palestinian people to another country, Israel. It doesn't make sense, right? Sounds simple, but it's not. Because it's reclaimed, right? The so-called right of return. So, difficult decisions to make. Difficult decisions, and they are more difficult because until now, the Palestinian leadership did not really stand in front of its own constituency and say, listen, it's not going to be easy, some things we will never get. The Israeli public understand that we will not get what, 100% what we want, maybe far from it. But nobody ever on the Palestinian side publicly said to the people, listen, there's going to be a compromise involved, a very serious compromise. Maybe dreams and fantasies that were elaborated for decades will not be fulfilled. It didn't happen. And you have to, in order to have real peace, you have to stop inside it, and more importantly, you have to understand, if not agree to, at least understand the narrative of the other side. It's a prerequisite. You have to have it. Otherwise, there's no peace. I want to quote you from the speech that Mahmoud Abbas gave at the General Assembly on 23rd September. He said, I come before you today from the Holy Land, the land of Palestine, the land of divine messages, ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the birthplace of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. Full stop. We don't exist. We have no connection to the land. Jews have nothing to do with this place. And this is in a speech that could have been directed to find some kind of a common ground with Israelis, to get into their hearts. Nothing. Not a simple omission. There was no coincidence. And unless that is somehow changed, unless you at least understand the narrative of the other side, it will be very, very difficult. But again, it's completely necessary. And when they come back and they are able to make these difficult decisions, they will find a willing partner. The quartet was calling for us to resume negotiation. We're ready. I know there's sometimes a tendency to criticize the current Israeli government, but the current Israeli government did things that no other government in Israel before it did. It did freeze the settlements for 10 months, for instance. When the Palestinians for 9 months did nothing, then came in the last month and said, we want more. It did make the situation in the West Bank and also in Gaza much, much better than before. It's you know, look at the UN reports, don't get it from me. And he's ready to accept, and this I can, you know, I don't know how much I can emphasize. Israel is ready to accept the Palestinian state next to it, wants to accept the Palestinian state next to it. But that will have to require the two sides sitting and negotiating and agreeing on the basic terms. Last two remarks I want to say is where I come from. And I'll finish with the positive side. I come from a very strategic, not now, not from New York, even though it's true as well. When I come from Israel, I still come from Israel. I come from a very problematic strategic environment. You know, one of the nice or the interesting things, not nice, interesting about the so-called Arab Spring, it's for years, many espouse the idea that everything which is wrong in the Middle East is related to, is a product of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict. And I think now those who push these ideas maybe have to think again. I hope they're thinking again. There were no signs against Israel at Tahrir Square. Maybe there will be now. So far, in the beginning, there weren't. You know, there's a report which I highly recommend to you to read. It's called the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, Arab report from 2002, and then they released a few reports since then, I think once or 2 years. 2 years. And these reports already in 2002, and the interesting stuff is that these reports were written by Arab scholars. They point to the basic issues that are restricting the growth in the Middle East. Lack of freedom, the place of women in society, cronies, stifling situation where culture is very difficult to grow. Nothing to do with us. And you see that now very, very clearly around us. Some of this yearning to get out of this is very vivid. But in the meantime, that means that our region is very unstable and might be, probably will be, very unstable for quite a long time. And always, of course, the possibility, as has been done in the past, when things are getting bad, it's very easy to manipulate everything to us. It's the Israelis. We don't have jobs, we don't have freedom. If instead of what we were hoping for, meaning democratic regimes, we'll have maybe the same thing but in a different format. Let's hope it doesn't happen, but I'm not sure. And of course the bigger threat is the Iranian threat. A nuclear program whose sole goal is to create a nuclear bomb. I have no doubt in your mind. And the implications, and this is maybe something that is very important to know, and not just for Israel. Yes, of course, we are very worried. The leaders talk openly about the fact that we shouldn't exist. We have, I think, a reason to be worried, even without the history that we bring with us. But it's not an Israeli problem. If Iran gets the bomb, there will be other countries who will get the bomb in the region. If that happens, it's the end of the Non-Proliferation regime. It's the end of the architecture of world security as we know it. We have the possibility of transfer of technologies to non-state actors in our region. You have a nuclear umbrella given to terrorist organizations that are, their sole goal is to fight Israel. what is Hamas for? And that means a lot of instability and dangerous situation for many countries in the region. Many countries in the region. Sorry, I said in the region because I was speaking of something else. It's a danger for the entire international community, and perhaps the biggest danger there is. I just, everything that's happening there, the world is in turmoil. So everything gets in the newspaper for one day, then it gets off. People think already of the next thing. Did you notice that there was a plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington? Do you know what that means? What that might have meant if it happened? Maybe an article in the New York Times, the next day we're thinking of other things. And what they do in Iraq, what they do in Afghanistan, and so on. We're dealing with a new situation, an old situation, some new asymmetric war, terrorists, very vividly in Gaza Strip and in Lebanon, while blending with the civilian population, shooting from the civilian population at our civilian population. What do you do in this situation? It's not so easy. Sometimes it's easy to criticize, but it's not easy to deal with this situation. There are more dilemmas that are very problematic here. So this is it's not even a nutshell, the environment. But I want to finish, as I said, with a positive turn. Because in the end of the day, with all these issues and problems, and perhaps it's a bit morbid here, I represent a country who is a member of the United Nations, who built a homeland for the Jewish people after thousands of years, who is proud to have a democratic system, a democracy in the Middle East that is withstanding very difficult trials, that has been able to revive its ancient language, that has a vivid and very lively cultural debate, and science, and creativity, whose economy is doing well. We don't have many natural resources. It's mainly because of the openness and the way people can express themselves and create. Was facing many challenges, including social challenges. You've seen the tents in Israel before they were here in New York and other places. But still has an okay standard of living and quality of living. The UN actually ranks Israel number 15, 1-5. I don't think it's too bad, taking into account what we have to face on a daily basis. We're trying to help other countries, especially developing countries, in many ways. And it slowly is integrating into important international organizations like the OECD and CERN in Geneva and others. And in this country, I always have to say, who has a very important, significant relationship with the US, with the United States of America. And nowhere is it more clear than in the UN setting. That Israel has no better friend than America. And we always appreciate that. So not everything is gloomy. And one has to stay optimistic, and I'm always an optimistic. I'm not sure my wife will agree with that. I'm trying to. And I do believe that with all the set downs and things that we have witnessed in the last few decades, history is not linear. So we may see, years in which it looks as if we are getting closer to somehow stabilizing that turbulent region of ours, and years where it looks almost hopeless. But I do think we are getting closer, and that we will find at the end of the day peace in the Middle East, and that we'll be able to foster better future for us and for our neighbors together in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And what we've done is we've collected a number of flashcards. We have a lot of questions, but what we decided to do in the interest of time is to kind of collect them as a collective. Some of the questions are the same. So here's the first one. I'll just go question by question, if that's okay with you. The first question is, for whatever the reasons, it appears that Israel is increasingly being isolated. Does Israel care? And if so, what should it do about it?
Well, I have to, this just relates to the last sentence of my presentation, I have to a little bit disagree with the premise. There are those who are trying to portray Israel as being isolated. I don't feel, and I don't think we are isolated. Again, I just mentioned a few things that happened in the last year that actually shows you that Israel is far from being isolated. We have very good relations, not only with our historical friends, but also with the new emerging powers, including in Asia. Very good bilateral relations that have been developing with emerging markets, with emerging countries. There is, admittedly, the issue of the Middle East conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that is something that is polarizing the international community. And even within that conflict, there are issues that are more debated than others. Not everybody likes what they perceive to be Israel's policy on certain issues. But to say we're isolated, again, I can point out to growing international trade, to growing international relations, in almost every field. Number of scientific collaborations. Again, there are those who would like to see us isolated, who would like to, again, for their own reasons. You know, yesterday evening, when I left New York, one of my diplomats, one of the people who work for me, came to see me and said, I just came back from the UN, and the Syrian delegate was going on for half an hour about Israel's crimes. Theater of the absurd. Syria is talking about Israel days in and day out. Now, I'm not talking about years before when Assad was the knight of human rights. You know, that should have gotten some kind of a peace prize. No, today, when he's butchering his people in broad daylight, even the Arab League now acknowledges that. So yes, and I'm not saying it's only Syria. Again, when I say that not everybody agrees with policies, again, I try not to live in a bubble. We understand that there's a lot of sentiments, and some of them, by the way, we share. This is why I don't like the idea that people are leaving. It's not that we completely don't understand the other side. We're trying to understand the other side very much, and I can understand at least parts of the narrative for sure. So there is a conflict here that we have to settle. There's no question about it. And not everybody agrees with our stance, or not everything that we stand for. But no real isolation in my mind.
Thank you. This is a question I believe is from a student, given the nature of the question. It's always nice to see students in the audience. Any advice for aspiring members of the Model United Nations?
Excuse me?
An aspiring member. Aspiring member of the Model United Nations.
Well, the United Nations, the Model United Nations is always a very good program, a very interesting one. I think it allows you to be subjected to international issues, to meet other people with different point of views. The advice is always the same. Try to understand the issues. Try to articulate what you stand for, and say it. And try to influence others as much as you can with your positions, but also listen to what the other side said. This is what the UN stands for. And I think one can get a lot from this.
Thank you. Another question. As a national security interest for Israel and for the United States, what is the danger of the influence of Iran and terrorist groups like Hamas in Latin America in general?
Iran is trying to penetrate everywhere they can. And the danger is there. Sometimes they're being revealed, like in West Africa lately. Sometimes it's more covert, it's more difficult. It's never for peaceful purposes. These things are never happening because someone wants to promote peace in the Middle East or peace in the world. And again, I bring you back to that plot that was covered here in the US. Think about it. In the middle of Washington. It's not, it's not somewhere in space. So it's like water. Whatever is easier, they'll try to get. And then it involves sometimes money that comes from sometimes very dubious sources, and weapons, and explosives, and influence, and sometimes connections that are things that are related to the nuclear program. This is something that the world has to face. And I stress that because 60 years after the Second World War, for many in the international community to face something is very difficult as a concept. Facing, for many people, is always by dialogue, and we'll speak to them, convince them. Well, don't be, why are we advocating pressure? Why advocating, we're all people. We forgot. And for some countries, it's easier to forget than others. For some countries, since the US is taking most of the burden, then it's always easier to talk only about, the nice things that we should do. But for the Iranians, that means nothing. That means more time to advance the nuclear program, that's it. They are playing with the international community, have been playing, will continue to play. Their sole purpose is to buy time. And through that, use that time in order to advance the nuclear program, the terrorist attacks in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other places, subversion actions in some countries in order to topple regimes that are too moderate for their liking. Look around the Middle East, try to find me one flashpoint where the Iranian involvement, and again, it's nothing to do with us. We didn't cover this. We didn't reveal that. It's these countries themselves. You will find a footprint everywhere. So, yes, it's a huge problem. Whoever doesn't understand that doesn't understand the consequences. If Hamas is being supported by Iran, and we know because some of the missiles they're shooting at us, for some reason, are very similar to Iranian missiles. That means Iran trying to derail any chance for peace in the Middle East. We will not have peace in the Middle East as long as that involvement is strong and continuing.
The next question is, what is the feeling of Israel toward President Barack Obama? We're not trying to put you on the spot.
No, of course not. I said very, very clearly, and I think it's easier for me because I work in the UN. Our relation with the US mission in New York are very, very strong, very, very intimate. Israel cooperates with the US on many, many issues. Israel has no better friend in the US on many, many issues. It's not very rare that we will stand together facing almost the rest of the world. That always has been the case, certainly since I remember entering into the foreign ministry, and hopefully that will always be, and I believe it will always be because it's not by coincidence. The describe it, and it's true for this administration and the administration before.
I just got another question from the audience. I'm going to combine it with another one. Is the first one, so I guess it's a question in two parts. Why doesn't Israel hire a good public relations firm to promote its views and counteract negative propaganda? And connected to this question, if you will, what can the average Joe do to support Israel?
Well, you know, if I take the advice of the first question, I'm out of a job. So I have to do some due diligence here to say, you know, my answer would be a bit, you know, might be affected by the results. It's, you know, we've been hearing these ideas for many, many years. Why don't we take a good PR firm and so on? You know, first of all, we're not against PR firms, and we are working with PR firms in many places. It doesn't, I mean, it's of course makes some of our information work better, but it's not want to create a miracle. You know, again, we are facing here serious forces. I just came from another meeting and I explained the same question more or less. You know, the narrative now is difficult because we are perceived to be the stronger part in many parts of the world. The fact that we are a small country with our history, surrounded by why we are surrounded, is very often forgotten. Very, very often, too often forgotten. We are the superpower. And in that setting, it's sometimes very difficult to change the mood because from the beginning, from the outset, there's one side who's the victim, and then there's you. But again, I don't feel that any reason to be discouraged. I still believe that many in the world understand our point of view, and it's not by chance that the Palestinians were not able to get the votes they wanted this week in the Security Council. And not just in the Security Council, we have friends in many, many quarters of the world. And one of the reasons why we have so many friends is the Jewish community, who is so supportive and who we see as a part of us, and this bond will always continue. We are one of them. And sometimes it's not easy. It's not easy to face, I suppose, people who are, you know, getting up and leaving, especially when you're a minority. But those who are doing that should know that they're fighting for a just cause, and that they're articulating the truth. And sometimes the truth is very hard to hear. And that I can attest in the UN setting more than anywhere else. You know, there's the Arab Spring, but when it comes to the UN, you'll see very small glimpses of that. And you saw nothing of that in the last decades. Where was any discussion about the failing of the system in our region? Where was this discussion? There was nowhere. The only discussion that we used to see is discussion about us, about Israel. Because everybody else is perfect. That is the truth in the UN. Everybody else around us are just perfect, so there's nothing to discuss. So Libya is heading the UN Human Rights Council. Why not? Why not? Please.
Mr. Ambassador, we're at the end at the 8:30 mark. I wanted to thank you so much for answering the questions. It's a pleasure to be here, for you to be here. On behalf of the School of International Public Affairs, I again want to thank you for being here this evening, and thank all of you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your civility to teach us. Thank
delighted that you were able to join us. And you're right, it's nicer here than New York, because I was there yesterday as well.
You have to defeat your enemies, otherwise there's no reason to do peace, right? As opposed to them, we don't put preconditions. We don't need to talk. Hopefully, and you go first and stop, but not in preconditions.
Apropos of what you were saying about Syria, there was a recent, I don't know if you saw it, on Frontline, they did a 1-hour program on what's going on in Syria. Yeah.
What a difference, huh? Just walking to the hall, just here, I was, how long have you been here?